A few days ago, the biggest problems for Manchester City were the lack of service that they were getting into Erling Haaland, a failure to capitalise upon Arsenal's defeat at Goodison Park, and Pep Guardiola's increasingly irrational rotation. Fast forward about 24 hours, and suddenly it's relegation, points deductions, and Pep resigning. 24 hours can be an awfully long time in football. Except, none of this is brand new. Question marks about Manchester City's finances, spending, and accounting predate even the implementation of Premier League spending restrictions, and FFP was advocated for by a number of Premier League teams, at least in large part, to try and keep newly mega-rich clubs like Manchester City and any teams who might seek to emulate them down. The most persuasive argument against profit and loss restrictions has always been that they serve to cement the status quo by entrenching already existing hierarchies, with the biggest clubs, Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal, etc., who already rake in the most cash, permanently being able to spend the most, barring any catastrophic mismanagement, and their supremacy therefore going unchallenged at the top end of the league. The crux of FFP is that it restricts the amount of money that a club can lose over a set period of time, currently £105 million over 3 years in the Premier League, excluding so-called virtue spending, and £53 million over 3 years in all UEFA competitions, including all spending, virtuous or otherwise. So FFP essentially monitors two things: profits and losses. If you wanted to get away with breaking FFP rules then, you would have to do one of two things. Either hide the true extent of your outgoings to make it look as though you are spending less, or artificially inflate your incomings, making your revenue appear to be far greater than it actually is. Manchester City are accused of having done both on an industrial scale over a period of almost a decade, and it really cannot be emphasised enough how significant and damning this is. In fact, in this case, breaching FFP regulations is very much a secondary charge. The real crime Man City are accused of committing, and it could actually constitute a crime should things get that far, is of providing false accounts and effectively lying about the club's finances en masse over a period of 9 years, during which time they were the most successful club in the division. There's a temptation, I think, amongst football fans to dismiss the likelihood of Manchester City ever being punished with anything more than a slap on the wrist, based upon what happened with their 2-year ban from UEFA and the Court of Arbitration for Sport overturning it on appeal, and that is understandable. But this case is a little different, both in terms of the charge sheet and the actual legal process, and the potential ramifications are absolutely enormous. Not just for Manchester City, though it could certainly be devastating for them, but for the entire Premier League and even the UK government, who will be at panic stations right now at the potential geopolitical fallout from this investigation. So that's what this video is all about. What Manchester City are accused of doing, what the evidence is, whether or not they're actually screwed this time around, and all of the other mess that this could cause, almost regardless of the outcome. When Sheikh Mansour acquired Manchester City from the former Prime Minister of Thailand, Thaksin Shinawatra, in 2008, the Citizens ranked outside of the top 20 Deloitte Football Money League rankings, with debts totalling £147 million, which was almost double their revenue the previous season. In the 2008-09 season, in which Man City forked out more than £120 million on new signings, including a British record fee of £32.5 million for Robinho in their first season under new ownership, their revenue actually fell from €104 million the previous season to €101.2 million, largely as a result of the club finishing one place lower in the Premier League table. That was to be a mere blip within the context of an irrepressible rise, though, both in terms of sporting attainment and revenue over the next 15 years. In that 2008-09 season, the bulk of the club's €101.2 million revenue came from the Premier League's redistributed broadcast deals. Meanwhile, just 1/5, 21.1 million euros came in the form of commercial deals. That skyrocketed by more than 170%, despite the fact that Man City had just finished 10th, one place lower than the previous season, in Emirati royal Sheikh Mansour's first full season owning the club, the 2009-10 campaign, up to 57 million euros. That sharp increase owed to new partnership agreements, including new front of shirt sponsors, with the likes of Etihad Airways, Etisalat, the Abu Dhabi Tourism Authority, and Arbar. The particularly observant among you may have already started to notice a bit of a pattern and one thing that all four of those commercial partners have in common, but more on that in a moment. Manchester City's revenue growth, and particularly their commercial revenue growth, didn't stop there, seemingly knowing no bounds. In the 2011-12 season, it more than doubled in the space of a single season yet again, rising to 138.5 million euros. That was largely due to the club entering into a massive agreement with Etihad Airways to sponsor the City of Manchester Stadium, which Man City don't even own, the council does, worth £400 million over the next 10 years. It was the biggest deal of its kind in all of world football, and indeed, in the history of world sport, exceeding even the naming rights of NFL stadiums in the United States, and the sheer size of it prompted immediate suspicion. Manchester City had gone trophyless the season before the deal was signed, taking their trophy drought up to 35 years since they won the League Cup in 1976, and they finished 5th the previous season, failing to qualify for the Champions League. The £400 million deal, nonetheless, was worth 4 times the amount that Emirates paid Arsenal for the naming rights to their new ground in 2006, at a time when Arsenal hadn't finished outside of the top 4 in a decade. UEFA said that they would investigate the size of the deal and whether it was a legitimate arrangement. Meanwhile, both Liverpool and Arsenal registered their own complaints. It was justified, by Etihad at least, on account of the fact that, whilst the initial cost might seem expensive, if Manchester City were to become tremendously successful over the next 10 years, it would become a reasonable deal. Manchester City did of course proceed to become very successful, particularly in the last 4 years of the initial 10-year deal, but it was later revealed that with that success, and on multiple occasions, Manchester City and Etihad had renegotiated the terms of that deal to reach an even higher fee, somewhat undermining that initial justification. It is easy to get lost in the weeds of each of these agreements, most of which I have followed for years thanks to the excellent work of Nick Harris from Sporting Intelligence specifically on this issue, but the crux of the matter is that Manchester City have a whole host of lucrative commercial deals with companies that are based in Abu Dhabi and just so happen to have close ties to their owner, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates and a member of Abu Dhabi's ruling royal family. Mansour, who is a multi-billionaire, heads up and sits on the board of a number of state-owned companies and sovereign wealth funds, some of whom are the majority shareholders of some of City's commercial partners. Etihad Airways, for instance, was owned by the state of Abu Dhabi before being transferred to the ownership of the UAE's sovereign wealth fund. Meanwhile, Mansour literally oversees former sponsors Arbar Investments, which is owned by Abu Dhabi's International Petroleum Investment Company, which is chaired by, you guessed it, Sheikh Mansour. Manchester City's commercial revenue has grown and grown since 2008, and during the pandemic, whilst everyone else's commercial revenue took a hit, Manchester City's actually rose. For the last 2 seasons, City have topped the Deloitte Football Money League, overtaking the likes of Manchester United, Real Madrid and Barcelona to become the richest football club in the world, with total revenue of £613 million in 2022, over half of which, £309.4 million, was commercial revenue. Man City signing the most lucrative shirt and stadium sponsorship deals in the entire history of the sport, growing their revenue during a pandemic, becoming the richest club on the planet and raking in more commercial revenue than Real Madrid or Barcelona might seem suspicious to you, and if it doesn't, then it really should. But what might be blindingly obvious to most football fans, including most Manchester City fans if they were to be honest with themselves, does not constitute conclusive evidence of wrongdoing. The legitimacy and legality of these kinds of murky sponsorship arrangements isn't exactly clear-cut. They were only recently actually suspended, temporarily, and then reintroduced but with much more scrutiny and requiring Premier League approval, following Newcastle United's takeover by Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, and Manchester City aren't alone in having engaged in them, even if they are the most prominent exponents here in England. What landed Manchester City in hot water with UEFA a few years ago, and now with the Premier League, isn't their owners' relationship with these companies or the size of these commercial deals per se, but rather whether the commercial revenue they received came from these companies at all. It has been widely alleged that Etihad, for instance, rather than having actually paid Manchester City their eye-watering sponsorship deals themselves, effectively acted as an intermediary between the club and Abu Dhabi, and Mansour, paying only a fraction of those sponsorship fees themselves. After Manchester City appealed their 2-year ban from UEFA, CAS, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, found the club's directors to be trustworthy and believed their denial of those accusations. Almost immediately after the club's UEFA ban was overturned, though, and Man City got away with a hefty €10 million fine instead of any, harsher actual sporting sanctions, Der Spiegel's football leaks were published. Do you remember them? Which included an email between Simon Pearce, who was a key figure at Man City at the time, in addition to advising some of the most senior figures in the UAE, and Peter Baumgartner, the COO of Etihad Airways, in which Pearce, whilst using an Executive Affairs Authority email address, which is a government agency in Abu Dhabi, appeared to admit to arranging a payment to Etihad on account of their sponsorship of the club, something that he denied on the record at the Court of Arbitration appeal process. I appreciate that this might be a lot of information, initialisms, and different organisations if you are unfamiliar with this stuff, and oftentimes it is intentionally confusing, but Der Spiegel's football leaks, at least as far as we know, appear to have been crucial to the Premier League opening an investigation into Manchester City, which they did almost 4 years ago. The more than 100 charges, or supposed breaches, brought against Manchester City at the beginning of this week were the culmination of that 4-year investigation. And as bullish as the club has been in response to the Premier League's announcement, the Premier League's conclusion is much more serious and damning than they likely would have imagined. In addition to commercial partnerships inflating the club's revenue, Manchester City are also accused of deflating, if you like, their outgoings by outsourcing the payment, most notably, of Yaya Toure and Roberto Mancini's salaries during their time at the club. Der Spiegel actually leaked supposed copies of Mancini's contracts, and yes, the plural is deliberate there, during his time at the Etihad, one of which detailed his salary and bonuses for working for Manchester City Football Club, and another which detailed his even higher base salary for working as a consultant for Al Jazeera Club of the UAE Pro League, a team who just so happened to be primarily invested in and effectively owned by a man named Sheikh Mansour. Whenever Manchester City have been asked about any of these leaks or allegations in the past, invariably they have responded with no comment. When Pep Guardiola was asked directly by a reporter at the time if he had ever received similar payments from any companies in the UAE, he was outraged at the mere suggestion, without ever, actually saying no. I am not suggesting that he has, just to be absolutely clear, but it was a perfectly legitimate question in the circumstances, and given the silence from the club themselves, making Pep the only port of call for journalists. Now Manchester City will have to respond to these allegations. The Toure and Mancini contract situations, I have seen it said by people who know a lot more about legal procedure than I do, which isn't much, is very much a tertiary issue, as indeed are any FFP breaches and Mansour's links to some of Man City's commercial partners. Make no mistake, in isolation, they would be serious allegations, opening the club up to potential fines, transfer bans, and even points deductions. However, they come in the context of the Premier League, the biggest league in all of world football, accusing Manchester City, by far the league's most successful club in recent years, of being flagrantly dishonest in their financial reporting over a period of 9 years. There are those who say, so what? We've seen it all before, they'll fine them 50 million quid, which is pocket change to Mansour, and maybe ban them from doing any transfer business for a season. Well, again, on account of people who know far more about this and the law more broadly than I do, including Stefan Borson, who is a lawyer and a former advisor to Manchester City that I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, that isn't really a possibility this time around. Or, at least it would take a fairly extraordinary chain of events and set of circumstances for that to be the end result. If the Premier League wanted to give Manchester City a slap on the wrist and tell them that they have been very naughty boys, the way in which to do that would have been to close their investigation on account of them not having enough evidence, and then to hand the club a massive fine for non-cooperation with that investigation. Throughout all of these cases, City's large and very expensively assembled legal teams have been described as obstructing almost any attempt to obtain any new information or documents. So that would have been a perfectly reasonable judgment and punishment on the part of the Premier League. It would also make lots of sense from the league's perspective. The Premier League is on top of the world right now, not only the most lucrative league in all of world football, a status which it has held for a couple of decades now, but actually having become a continental and indeed global hegemon in recent years, with an ever-widening chasm between it and Europe's other leagues, as has been illustrated by recent broadcast deals and transfer expenditure. The Premier League, and I am far from the first person to make this observation, is already a de facto Super League. All of the clubs just happen to be based in England. Historically, the league has always been very reluctant to rock the boat, so to speak, especially among its most powerful shareholders, of which Manchester City are most assuredly one. There is an understandable cynicism, then, among people who think that the Premier League will never take radical action against Manchester City, but that rather overlooks the fact that this is already radical action. The accusations that they have levelled, very publicly, at Manchester City are so severe that it is hard to see how they could row back now or find any kind of off-ramp, even if they were concerned about reputational damage to the Premier League as a whole. Evidently, saying, our most successful club of the past decade, who have won 6 out of the last 11 Premier League titles, are a bunch of dishonest crooks who got where they are now by cheating, isn't exactly a great look. But it is probably a slightly better look than saying, our most successful team are a bunch of crooks, we know that they're a bunch of crooks, we have all of the evidence to prove it, but we're not actually going to do anything about it, i.e., no sporting punishment, just a meaningless financial one. Because you see, if an independent panel finds against Manchester City, those are the Premier League's only 2 options now. What's more, whilst Man City are among the league's most important shareholders, so too are all of their rivals, who will be gunning and lobbying the Premier League for them to get the harshest possible punishment, i.e. expulsion. Since this is a matter for the Premier League, not the FA, if Manchester City were expelled from the Premier League, and we are speculating wildly into the future at this stage, but just embellish me anyway, it would then be up to the EFL and their shareholders, that is to say, EFL clubs, to decide whether to admit Manchester City and at what level of the pyramid. Theoretically, at least as far as I'm aware, it would be within their rights to refuse Man City's entry to the EFL entirely, and if you were a team with aspirations of winning promotion, I suppose why would you want a team that is almost guaranteed to win the league to compete against you? That, of course, is the worst possible scenario for Manchester City, and it is beyond my pay grade, especially at this stage, to try and speculate what might actually happen. That doesn't mean that I can't give it a go, though, with the obvious caveat that this is pure speculation based upon what we know so far and what I have heard from people very well versed in these sorts of cases. My best guess is that there is probably about a 70-30 chance that Manchester City are eventually cleared by a panel of any wrongdoing, which would be humiliating for the Premier League, but that still leaves a sizable prospect that the panel will be convinced by the evidence brought forward by the Premier League's investigation, and in that case, the punishment will have to be enormous. If that were to happen, I genuinely would not rule out expulsion from the league, because if it is proven that a club has lied, systemically, for a decade about their finances, flagrantly and with intent to deceive, for the purpose of breaching the league's rules, which is a very nice way of saying cheating, how could they possibly not impose the harshest possible punishment? Almost nothing else would pass the smell test, the precedent it would set would be appalling, and every other club in the league would be furious. It also seems likely, despite suggestions to the contrary from both parties, that the conclusion of this will not be swift. We are talking about 9 years of financial accounts, more than 100 charges relating to a whole host of issues, and some of the best lawyers in the world on either side who are going to get incredibly rich whatever happens, but especially if it drags on and on. Manchester City's strategy, seemingly, has long been to wage a war of attrition with some of the world's best legal representation, thwarting and frustrating the process throughout. That might not work quite so well this time around. For a start, the Premier League will have just as capable, highly paid, and plentiful legal representation, who they can afford to pay for as long as they like, but even more importantly, for as long as this case remains unresolved, it will hang like a dark cloud over the Etihad, arriving at a time when the team already looks to be wobbling a little, Pep Guardiola's future has been thrown into doubt, and recruiting the very finest players could become a real challenge. If you were to join Manchester City right now, it is possible, however unlikely you may deem it, that they could be kicked out of the division and you might find yourself playing lower league football. If Man City are really confident about their chances, as they claim, they could offer players get-out clauses should the worst happen. But even just the sheer optics of that coming up in a negotiation are a terrible look for the club, and one that their rivals would undoubtedly look to capitalise on. Given the amount of players who were already expected to leave the Etihad in the summer, following João Cancelo's January departure, Manchester City probably need an overhaul, or at the very least a refresh, over the next 12 to 18 months. So any hindrance in the transfer market is going to be deeply problematic, even if they eventually get the most positive possible outcome from this case at this stage. It's important to note that, if found guilty, and I am yet to see anyone dispute this fact, what Manchester City are accused of doing, that is to say, falsifying financial documents and reporting junk accounts, is illegal. It's not just breaching some obscure rules in the world of football, which could result in some football sanctions, it is a legal activity which could result in conviction, which is particularly interesting given that the people at the top of Manchester City, and those who would be culpable, are not insignificant figures. Khaldoon Al-Mubarak, for example, who is the chairman of Manchester City, and is often referred to as being Sheikh Mansour's right-hand man, is an Emirati government official. He is a senior figure within the government of Abu Dhabi, and he has served as the UAE's presidential special envoy to the People's Republic of China since 2018. Mubarak was even given a CBE, making him a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, along with a whole host of other Emirati royals and politicians, in 2011. Without wishing to get too derailed from football, the UAE was, until gaining independence in 1971, an officially designated British protectorate, and the UK still has extremely close ties to the Gulf Sheikhdom, which has been described as a special relationship. UK imports from the UAE total almost £6 billion a year and exports in excess of £9 billion, making it roughly the UK's 20th largest trade partner, despite the UAE being home to fewer than 10 million people. That's why I said during the introduction that Whitehall will be at panic stations over the Premier League, which is one of the UK's biggest brands, and I use that word intentionally, accusing a club which is owned by an Emirati royal and run by senior figures within the UAE of being cheats, lies and crooks. In that regard, this is even bigger than football, and if a panel were to find against the club, the prospect of further legal action, tax, and HMRC investigations into senior figures at the club would all be a nightmare scenario for the UK government, which is keen to preserve that special relationship. So, that is the long and short of the investigation into Manchester City, the breaches that they're accused of, my wild speculation as to the likely outcome, which you can probably disregard, and some of the potential ramifications both within and outside of the sport. One of the common responses to anything relating to Manchester City is, well, what about Chelsea or Manchester United or XYZ? Ultimately, the Premier League's investigation, again, as far as we know, and it does seem pretty certain, was prompted by the Der Spiegel leaks. Without similar evidence of wrongdoing on the part of other clubs, it seems improbable that the Premier League will launch similar investigations into them because, well, they wouldn't have any grounds to launch an investigation. The timing of this is interesting, not so much because of the independent regulator that was due to be announced by the government to oversee English football earlier this week, which was opposed by the Premier League, the timing of which I suspect is largely coincidental, but because of the recent action taken against Juventus. I recently made a video about Juventus's supposed financial skullduggery and the case against them, and in it, I mentioned the fact that a lot of what they are accused of doing, such as inflating transfer fees in swap deals, like those involving Arta and Miralem Pjanic with Barcelona, were very well known. Almost everyone suspected, or even outright stated, that that was what they were doing at the time. But since nothing happened, there was just sort of a general assumption that it must all be above board or somehow allowed. I mentioned in that video that similar to that was Manchester City, raking in more commercial revenue than any other club in the world, and, well, about a week later, this happens. Maybe if I mention the obvious falsehood that Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, which is owned by Saudi Arabia and whose chairman is Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, not having any links to the state of Saudi Arabia as the Premier League claims, or how weird it is that Gianni Infantino literally lives in Qatar, despite FIFA's headquarters being located in Switzerland, where he's actually from, there will be some investigations and charges brought against them next week. Hey, it's worth a go. Before I leave you, since it does seem worthwhile to add, even if a panel finds Manchester City guilty of all 100 plus breaches and the Premier League expels them and strips them of everything that they won during that time, that will not be the end of Man City. Much as it may be used as a stick to beat Man City fans with by rival supporters, the club has a rich and fascinating history and tradition. Their success in recent years might be owed to the investment of Sheikh Mansour, but their existence is not. And Man City have fallen out of the top flight in the past, without actually ceasing to exist, and inevitably at some stage, fighting their way back to the top table of English football. As for whether these revelations tarnish Manchester City's success over the past 12 or 13 years, well, I suppose my own view would be, what revelations? Perhaps if you were somehow unaware of these allegations ever having existed, and thought Man City had legitimately grown the largest commercial revenue in the history of world football, this might change your perspective somewhat. But even then, Man City are a state-backed enterprise who have become enormously successful as the result of an enormous amount of money having flooded into the club since 2008, and having been very well invested. whether that money was injected into the club legitimately by a plutocratic autocracy in Western Asia, or whether it broke Premier League rules, to me at least, is relatively trivial when it comes to assessing the legacy and validity of that success. What I am saying is that if you thought Man City bought their success before these charges were levelled against them, and that it was all a shameful, illegitimate sham, or whether you thought that every team buys their success in football, Man City is no different, and the football that they have served up over the past decade has been a joy to behold, I just don't really think that your perspective should have changed over the last week. But hey, that's just me. That's it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And, of course, make sure that you are subscribed. It goes without saying. I can't believe that anyone wouldn't be at this stage. And have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.